In 1985, Margaret Atwood wrote a book called A Handmaid's Tale. How many of you read that book? Required reading in a lot of high school and college lit classes. I don't know why. It's a really dark, sinister, painful, brutal story, in its own way perhaps beautiful in a bit, because the story is told in this fictional world that Margaret Atwood describes. It's told from the standpoint of a handmaid. Now here's the situation in Margaret Atwood's story, and it's received some renewed interest of late because Hulu has now put it out as a series in a two-year series already on Hulu, A Handmaid's Tale. But here's the story in case you neither read nor watch television. Margaret Atwood imagines a dystopian, that is the opposite of utopian, a dystopian future in kind of current day America, but just on the far side of some great environmental disaster that has rendered almost the entire world's female population unable to bear children. Well, this is, of course, an enormous crisis, because everyone realizes, oh my goodness, the clock is really ticking now and we're just a generation away from no humanity. So they begin to get more and more inhuman as they give in to totalitarian kind of regimes, anybody offering comfort and peace. And so America becomes dominated by a kind of hyper, almost religious, cultic, super powerful, dominating party that puts a whole other set of rules in place, and people just hand over their freedoms to this. It's a cautionary tale. Well, in the story, there were a few women that apparently, for whatever reason, were still able to bear children. These were summarily rounded up and then assigned out to the wealthiest and most powerful families in America. And these women, these young women, these handmaids, virtually and literally slaves, it might as well have been sex trafficking, are handed over against their will, put into a wealthy household, and then in a kind of bizarre religious ritual, were given by the wife of the home to the man of the home in order to have relations so that she might bear a child, this handmaid, that then the mistress of the home would raise as their own. And so these handmaids have a horrible, horrible existence. The beauty of the story is that it's told by one of these handmaids who just continues against hopeless odds to cling to the hope that she's still a human and a person, and her desire and will to survive is the beauty of it still. But it is a painful, dark story. Read or watch it with caution. 4,000 years ago, before Margaret Atwood, this story was already told. So I assume Margaret has paid royalties to the Bible. Because in the book of Genesis, 2000 BC, something very similar to this story actually happened, and it's found in Genesis chapter 16, which is our scripture passage for today. See how eerily similar this is. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian slave whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go in to my slave. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw, that is Hagar, that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And so then Sarah said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace. Now that she's conceived, she looks on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." And Abram said to Sarah, "Behold, your slave is in your power. Do to her as you want." So Sarah dealt harshly with Hagar, so that she fled from her. Now the angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And the angel said, "Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from? And where are you going?" And Hagar said, "I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarah." The angel of the Lord said, "Well, return to your mistress and submit to her." Then the angel said also to her, but I will surely multiply your offspring, so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. Then the angel also said, behold, you are pregnant, and you're going to bear a son, and you're going to call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He'll be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, but he'll dwell over against all his kinsmen. So Hagar called out and on the name of the Lord, who spoke to her and said, wow, you're a God of seeing. For she said, truly, I have seen him who sees me. And Hagar went back and bore Abram a son. And Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael, which means God hears. Pretty dark story. Pretty dark. The current issue of Oprah's O magazine, if you have a long line at the checkout stand at Publix, go ahead and look at it. But a quote from Oprah on the front of the magazine says, you want to know the most beautiful, complex, perfectly imperfect word I know? It's the word family. That makes some good sense. Now, I know families are great. Families are the place for butterfly kisses and pictures up on the refrigerator and cheering for you while you do arias or touchdowns. But families are also the place of weird uncles and estranged siblings and all manner of wickedness passed on from one generation to the next at times. Families. You ever watch the game Family Feud? You familiar with this? You know, where Hatfields and McCoys kind of line up against each other and try to win. But the trouble is, so many times the family feuds are actually between Hatfields and Hatfields. Actually, domestic trouble. Any police person will tell you the place they don't want to go is try to break up a domestic dispute. You get fired at from both sides. Family fights are the worst of them all. And the story here in Genesis is telling about the Abraham family feud. So on one side, we've got Hagar, the Egyptian slave, and her son Ishmael. On the other side, we have Sarah, Abram's wife, and their eventual child, Isaac. And these two are kind of battling it out, you know, beeping for the buzzer. Who gets Abraham's blessing? You know, who's going to win this? And they're sure enough in struggle and enmity for generation, well, to this very day. Family fights are just the hardest of them all. And what's very interesting to me about this first family, because we look, all of us, back to Abraham as his father of faith, you know, this first family is painfully warped. If you're looking for an example of how to do family, read this one and then do the opposite. Because every mistake you can make, they make somehow. For instance, Sarah was apparently much more beautiful than Abraham. I feel this pain because my wife is also much better looking than I am. So people are always saying to me, oh, is that your wife? I thought it was your daughter. I've heard that so many times. Stop it. We were going through a passport check thing in another country recently, and they looked at me and looked at my passport. They looked at Connie and her passport. And the guy looked up at me and he winked and he said, boy, you're boxing above your weight class, aren't you? So Abraham, I get your pain. But when Abraham went down to Egypt one day on sojourn, because Sarah was pretty, he said, Sarah, when we get down there, I'm going to tell everybody you're my sister because I don't want someone who wants you to kill me to get to you, so let's just pawn you off as my sister. Can you believe they did that? Well, God spanked his hand pretty much for that and saved him from that, but then he did it again a little bit later in the story. I mean, the guy can't learn. And when they have children, they're playing favorites all the time with their children. How many of you were the favorite child growing up? So you think, well, this is good parenting, but it's not, because the rest of us don't feel good about it. And the way families are supposed to be in this century, the oldest one is supposed to get all the favor. Well, Ishmael is the first one born, but Isaac, the second one born, gets all the favor. And this will repeat itself again and again. Abraham, then to have Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah. Rebekah also can't have children. She finally gets a child. They have twins. Esau is the firstborn, and Jacob. Esau should be the child of promise, but it's the secondborn, Jacob, that seems to get all the favor. And Isaac favors Esau. Rebekah favors Jacob. You can imagine the tension that got set up from that. And then Jacob gets married. He falls in love with Rachel, beautiful Rachel. But Rachel in the Bible is described as lovely to look upon. I don't know why I just did that, but you get the picture. She's lovely to look upon, the Bible says. Leah is described, her sister, as having weak eyes. So which one do you think is at home on prom night? And so Jacob comes to town, meets the two sisters, and guess what? He falls in love, not with the older sister, but with the second born. Now, by the way, I'm a second born, so I'm kind of starting to like this story. But anyway, he falls in love with, Rachel. They get married. He thinks he gets married. He wakes up the next morning on what he thought was his wedding night, and when he turns on the tent light, it's Leah, slipped in the dark by that scoundrel Laban. So anyway, he works 7 more years and gets to marry Rachel. He's married to both of them. Well, there's a messed up family. Anyway, and Jacob loves Rachel, doesn't really care for Leah. But every time Jacob passes by Leah's tent, she gets pregnant. His shadow will do it, But Rachel, his beloved, once again, 3rd generation in a row, she can't have any children. She's anguishing about that. Like her grandmama Sarah, she even offers to give a handmaid, somehow got to catch up. Finally, one day, she does have a child, and she names her child Joseph, which means, God, give me another one, because I'm catching up now. And God gave her another one. His name was Benjamin, and she died in childbirth. Because in this society, if a woman didn't bear children, she was nobody. Dean Martin sang in the 60s, you're nobody till somebody loves you. A lot of people have cried into their beer at singles bars over that, but that's how it felt. Now, that's not true today. There are women today who do not have children. Thank God they don't have children, don't intend to have children, and they're not disobeying God or anything else. But in this day, that was the one and only thing that defined what it meant to be a fulfilled female. So it was dreadful. But this family system continuing to pass it on, just dreadful. Leah, by the way, in Hebrew, Leah means cow. Rachel in Hebrew means daddy's little lamb. Leah never had a chance. Unless you just love Chick-fil-A, nobody wants to be a cow, I heard of a woman texting to her husband, these smartphones, smarter than we are. She texts him a picture from the dressing room. Does this dress make me look fat? And of course, he knows that's a trick question. He replies back, no, N-O-O. But the phone autocorrects it to moo, M-O-O. It's called a smart aleck phone. Well, that was an awkward breakfast. So back to the story of Abraham and Sarah. The point is, this is a really messed up family. You think your family's messed up? Well, get on board. Because here's the great thing about this story. If God can use this family, God can use anybody's family. You know what? If I were in charge of this is the father of the faith. These stories were told around campfires for 1,000 years before anybody wrote them down. I think if it had been up to me, I'd have cleaned this story up some. I'd have whitewashed this story and done some spin doctoring on it and got a promotion specialist, and I would have really cleaned up Abraham and Sarah. But the Bible is so painfully honest. It's like that makeup mirror with the lights and the magnifier. Oh. And it just shows everything. And I love that about the Bible because it helps me connect to it. These rough edges are the Velcro that help me connect. How about you? So Sarah has no children. She's no children. Now, at age 75, Abraham got this promise from God, you're going to be a daddy, and you're going to be the father of a great multitude. They're going to be like sands of the sea and stars of the sky. And this is Abraham's great moment. Abraham at 75 just believed that, and God counted it as righteousness. Now, why in the world would he believe that? 75, he's already having to live on mandatory distributions from his IRA, right? He's in the last couple of years is trying to shoot his age still. 75. And he thinks he's going to have a child. Does anybody really want a child at 75? This is going to bring fear throughout this entire congregation here. You think, Just thought I was safe. Oh no, 75. I mean, you can barely stand the grandkids coming from a long weekend, right? I mean, this is, parenting is a young person's sport. It's not for us. But he wants to. He says, okay, we're going to have a child. Yeah. Well, then 10 years go by and there's no child. 10 years. Now he's 85. Okay? So now he's not playing tennis, he's playing pickleball. And so Sarah comes to him. Boy, I'm going to hear about it from some of you already. But anyway, Sarah comes to him and says, Abraham, you know, I've been thinking this last decade, this old dusty promise of God, maybe God's been waiting on us to help out and do our part. That kind of makes good sense, doesn't it? So I've got this Egyptian slave, this trinket I picked up when we lived down in Egypt. He doesn't call her by name. In fact, in the story, nobody ever talks to Hagar or calls her by name except for God. For everybody else, she's just a thing. I got this slave, this Egyptian slave. Maybe I'm going to send her in to the tent. You lay with her. Maybe she'll have a child, and then I'll raise that child as my own. You hear Margaret Atwood's story coming to life? What does Hagar feel about this? Well, it doesn't matter. She's a nobody. She's property. She's a slave. She doesn't have control over her own body. This is not much different than rape. And she is thrust into this man's lap that she doesn't care for, nor who cares for her. And she conceives. Well, she begins to show with pregnancy. I don't know why I did that. It begins to look pregnant when I do it. Need not to do that in the next service. Anyway, so now all of a sudden, the Bible text that I read said that she despised, looked with contempt on Sarah. Beg to differ. Actually, the Hebrew phrase says she just looked differently at Sarah than she used to. The point is, I don't think she lorded over Sarah. She just stopped believing that Sarah lorded over her. She saw herself as a sister. I mean, Sarah still is the mistress of the home. Sarah still has the really nice chariot with a little German emblem on front. I mean, Sarah's still the wealthy one, okay? But she has something Sarah doesn't have, right? You know, nobody wants the help getting uppity. How dare that slave think she can look me in the eye? And Sarah just will have none of it. And so she goes to Abraham and she says, this is all your fault. Don't you love that? It was her idea 10 years ago. This is all your fault. You know the old joke that if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, it's still a man's fault. All right, so somehow this is all Abraham's fault. She says, what were you doing? She's looking at me on contempt, and Abraham, in one of his great moments of no backbone, says, hey, I'm not getting in the middle of this cat fight. She's your slave. You do whatever you want to. I'm going to go back to ESPN. So Sarah did just what she wanted to. She treated her Egyptian slave harshly. These exact same pair of words, Hebrew master, Egyptian slave, that one book later in the book of Exodus, it'll all flip. And an Egyptian master, Pharaoh, will have Hebrew slaves, offspring of Abraham, and he will treat them, guess what? Harshly. Same word. So much so that the slave, once again, has to run and flee into the wilderness. What goes around comes around, doesn't it? And it's no more noble whichever way it happens. So Hagar runs. So sometimes it just felt anywhere better but here. Well, of course, she runs from the frying pan into the fire. Now she's in the wilderness and cannot survive. Expecting a child, she can't survive out there. There's no 7-Eleven out there. And in that moment, when she sits down to die, God shows up. God shows up. Now there's the good news of this whole story. God keeps showing up. Right when you think there's nobody, and certainly no God. And God shows up to Hagar and says, Hagar, wow, her name, Hagar, where'd you come from and where are you going? Notice she only answers the first question because she hadn't gotten in touch with where she's going. All she can say is, I'm a runaway slave. It's where I'm from. And maybe that's why the angel sent her back. She wasn't ready yet. Not everybody who yearns to be free learns to be free. Though freedom was within her reach, it wasn't yet within her grasp, maybe. There are people who aren't ready to retire. They aren't ready maybe to get through their relationship junk because they're not figured out what they're trying to get to yet. She wasn't ready yet, maybe. I don't know. But the point is, or maybe because her best chance in her babies to survive is still back there in that slavery for now. Tragically, 150 years ago, Southern preachers used this as a proof text for why God favors slavery. And of course, we were dead wrong. Slavery was then, and it is now for the 70 million people the UN says are still slaves in this world, most of whom are women and young children in the human and sex trafficking industry. Slavery was wrong then, it is wrong now. And there's a part of us that wants to shake Abraham and Sarah and say, what were you thinking? Having slaves, much less treating her this way. But now this isn't pummel your patriarch day. I mean, the point is we need to kind of have a humility about this because I think Abraham and Sarah would say, well, it's just the way, I know, but it's the way things were done. And I dare say that 3 generations from now, our great-grandchildren's generation will look back to our time and say, in the light of history where things are clearer, I'm going to guess, what will they say? Where was the church? What were you all thinking? Were you asleep when this and this and this and this happened? What were you thinking when racism and bigotry was still that prevalent? What were you thinking when you threw away 40% of your food every year while 10% of your population went to bed hungry? What were you thinking? What were you thinking when you could take the life of a very late term, if not actually born baby? What were you thinking? Where was the church when you were just pillaging your environment? Why weren't you up in arms? And we'll probably say, oh, well, it's just the way it was done. Well, this was a terrible thing in Abram and Sarah's life, but it is the way things were done. And Hagar comes back, but only because she met the God in the wilderness where she said, wow, you are the God who, wow, you really see me. Amy Grant has a song written in the 1980s called El Shaddai, which means God Almighty. There's one verse out of that, if you know this song, where she talks about this passage. She sings in the song, she says, through the blood and through the ram, you saved the God of Abraham. By the power of your hand, you turned the sea into dry land. But to the outcast on her knees, you were the God who really sees. And by your might, you've set your children free. It was this moment in the wilderness that she learned, you're a God who really sees. And friends, I don't know what you've learned in the darkness and in the wilderness that you have or will face, but I hope that's what you learn too. At the end of the rope, there's God. It gave her the courage to go back home, and so she did. And then she has a child, Ishmael, and it seems to be going well. Sarah's raising Ishmael. Abram loves Ishmael. Ishmael seems to be the beginning of the great line. And then 10 years later, the most hilarious thing happened. Sarah got pregnant. Whoa, that'll scare you. Sarah got pregnant. She's 90 and Abraham is 100. Let that sink in. They're thinking, does Medicare even pay for this? There's not a single article in the AARP journal about child raising. How old will I be when this kid finishes high school? You know. Anyway, but they're so full of joy about it, they named the child Laughter. Isaac means laughter. Everybody come laugh with us, and they were. So 2 years later, after Isaac is weaned, that is, he's finally, on to eating hot dogs and stuff. And so because he's weaned, what that means is they throw a party because it means, hey, shoo, the kid's going to make it. So many children died in infancy, like little turtles trying to get their way across the beach to the sea, That risky first little bit was when a lot of kids died. So when you weaned them, it meant, all right, they're going to make it. So they have a party when they wean Isaac. He's 2 years old. And in the story, this is Genesis 21, but in the story, Isaac is on the floor of the tent, and Ishmael, his 10-year-old big brother, is playing around on the floor with him. In fact, literally it says Ishmael was Isaacing around with Isaac. He was just laughing around with little laughter. Now you would think, that Sarah, seeing this, would say, Abram, come quickly, bring the camcorder. This is so cute. This is a Hallmark card. This will be next year's Passover card picture for us. You know? Hadn't been Passover yet. Sorry, that was an anachronism. But anyway, this is going to be great. But no, what happens? Sarah's eyes narrow, and her heart turns to stone. And she says, what is that son of a slave? What is he doing playing with my boy? He's not going to inherit with my boy. There have been a whole lot of families, a whole lot of businesses, and a whole lot of kingdoms that have crumbled and tottered over the question of who's going to inherit this between all this mixed up set of kids, right? This is difficult. This is tough. Do I have to love him? You know. But Sarah goes to Abram and says, this is all your fault, of course. Throw that Egyptian slave out and her boy, that boy. And Abraham, in another great moment of strength, says, okay. The sculpture that you see on the screen from a museum here in the U.S. tries to capture the image of Abraham hugging the neck of his son, whom he knows he won't see again, while Sarah is standing there looking at her clock saying, okay, come on, get on with it. I don't know exactly what that scene was like, but here's what I do know. Abraham sent Ishmael and Hagar out into the wilderness again with 1 day's rations of food and water. He didn't send her out with 3 months' worth. He didn't send her out with a train of camels. He didn't send her out with a garrison of soldiers. He sent her out only with enough provision to get far enough away from the house before they died so that the death of them wouldn't mess up a good sunset from the veranda. I'm not going to remember Abraham and Sarah always for this moment because I hope I'm not remembered all my life for my worst moment either. But this is not a good moment. Sarah becomes almost a quintessential wicked stepmother here, doesn't she? Disney has given us these from the Grimm, Cinderella and Snow White, the Baroness von Schlatter, in Sound of Music. All the little Von Trapps are loving, wishing it could be Julie Andrews, but they're stuck with the Baroness, It's a tough thing to be a step anything. Some of you know. Some of you know. It's the only thing more difficult than parenting is step parenting. And not all of them are wicked, but Sarah deserves on that screen for this one. And so Hagar and Ishmael are down there, and the last drop is squeezed out of the canteen. And she can't bear to just watch her son die. Could you? So she finds a little bit of shade under a little bush and puts him there and gets just enough away for her own death. It's not that she prays. She just expires one last drop of moisture and silently sobs to the heavens. And guess what happens? God shows up. And God says to Hagar, 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 remember me? We met here before. I've heard your cries. I've heard the cries of the boy. And I'm going to take care of him and you. I'm going to give you a future and him. I'm going to bless him. God gives Ishmael the blessing Abraham wouldn't give him. I'm going to take care of him. I'm going to nurture him. He's going to become a great nation. You're going to take him on back to Egypt. And Ishmael is saved by God. He'll have a descendant one day named Muhammad, who would be the founder of a world religion called Islam. I told you this family was messed up wide, We're kin to a whole lot more folk than we thought we were going to be if we're all going to keep naming God as God, right? So what does that mean? Wow. There's a wideness in God's mercy for sure. But I am the God who really sees, God says. I'm the God who really hears. What does God hear? God can hear the sound of a single teardrop trickling down the human cheek. God hears that. And that's the reason, my friends, at the end of the day, at the end of all of our days, it's going to be okay. You are safe. As Jesus said, even if a sparrow falls, God notices and God cares. Well, you're of more value than many sparrows. And I promise you this is the lesson from Hagar in the wilderness. You can lean on those everlasting arms. Amen? Amen.